Today we're going to go over integration by parts. And to derive the formula for integration by parts, we're going to start off with the product rule, which we're all very familiar with. So let's start out with the function f of x times g of x. G of x, and let's find the derivative of this function, d over d of x equals, and through the product rule we know that it would be f prime of x times g of x plus f of x times g prime of x. Now we can integrate both sides of the equation, which would make this side become simply f of x times g of x equals the integral of f prime of x times g of x dx plus, again, the integral of f of x times g prime of x dx. Now we can take this equation, we can isolate for this term over here, moving this term over to the other side. So let's do that, isolating for this term. Integral of f of x times g prime of x dx equals f of x g of x minus the integral of f prime of x times g of x dx. So here we have the formula for integration by parts. So how would this be useful? If you ever have an integral where you can sort of divide it into components, where one component would be f of x, another component could be categorized as g prime of x, you can use this formula to integrate it. And we'll be using this in the next example. Alright, so now we're going to be doing an example integration by parts. The example we have here is integral of x squared minus 1 times e to the x dx, and above in purple we have the definition or the formula for integration by parts. To start off, we have to look at the integral and assign one component to be f of x and the other component to be g prime of x. Now, how we choose which to assign which is f of x would be the component that, if derived, would become simpler, and g prime of x would be the component where, if you find the antiderivative, it wouldn't become any more complicated. So let's look at the integral. We have x squared minus 1. If we find the derivative of that, we get 2x, which is simpler, therefore we can assign this to be f of x. If we look at e to the x, if we find the antiderivative of that, we again get e to the x, which isn't any more complicated, so we can label this g prime of x. So let's write this down. G prime of x equals e to the x, and f of x equals x squared minus 1. Now if we look in the formula, we also need g of x and we also need f prime of x, so let's also find that. Now g of x would be the antiderivative of e to the x, which is again e to the x, and f prime of x would be 2x. Now I'm going to change the color to orange and let's solve this. So now we just have to follow the formula. The formula says f of x times g of x minus the integral of f prime of x times g of x dx. So let's fill it in. F of x times g of x is x squared minus 1 times e to the x times e to the x minus the integral of f prime of x, which is 2x times g of x, which is e to the x dx. Now, because this is a constant 2, we can actually bring this out. So let me write this out again. It's again x squared minus 1 times e to the x minus 2x e to the x dx. Now, again, we have another integration by parts here, so we have to assign one of them to be f of x and the other one to be g of x. So again, f of x is the one that when derived becomes simpler. So if we look at x, the derivative of x is just 1, which becomes similar. So let's label that f of x. And e to the x, if we find the antiderivative, it's still e to the x. It doesn't become any more complicated. So let's label that g prime of x. So let's write this down. G prime of x equals e to the x. G of x equals e to the x. F of x equals x, and f prime of x equals 1. Okay, so let's continue. Let's rewrite this. X squared minus 1 e to the x minus 2. And again, because we're finding the integration of this portion, we have to use this formula again. So again, f of x times g of x, f of x is x times e to the x minus the integral of f prime of x times g of x. F prime of x is 1, and g of x is e to the x, so e to the x dx. Let's continue. X squared minus 1 e to the x minus 2 x e to the x. Now, the integral of e to the x is e to the x dx is still e to the x, so let's simplify and write that. And in this step, let's expand the bracket and bring it all out. So we have x squared minus 1 e to the x minus 2x e to the x minus plus 2e to the x. Let's bring this down a bit. Now if you notice, each of the terms has e to the x, e to the x, e to the x, so we can actually just factor that out. So we have e to the x bracket x squared minus 1 minus 2x plus 2. Now we can collect these like terms, so let's write that out as well. E to the x squared minus 2x plus 1. And finally, we have to add the constant c plus c. So there you have it, the integral of x squared minus 1 e to the x dx equals e to the x times x squared minus 2x plus 1 plus c.